Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to Black Spy Podcast, the show that lifts the lid and shines a light onto the hitherto hidden world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. Today's episode is entitled Royalty and Me, Princess Diana, an audience with future King Charles, guest of a Saudi royal prince, and creating a moment of freedom for the Queen of Nepal.
For more than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.
The first physical meeting I had with Princess Diana was when I was assigned the role of protecting the Governor-General of Canada. Now, as you know, Canada was once a dominion of the United Kingdom's colonies, and therefore the head of state of Canada is the Queen of England. For that, read the Queen of the United Kingdom. So they have a Governor-General, and that Governor-General obviously reports to the United Kingdom as the representative of the Queen in Canada. I was assigned to carry the protection because of her role, and at the time you had the Quebec situation. The province of Quebec seemed intent on wishing to secede from the Union of Canada. And of course there were some violent aspects to that. So due to the Quebec problem, the Governor-General was provided special branch protection. And as the North American desk officer, which meant that I dealt with all of the political elements, espionage, proliferation regarding North America, I was provided the task of running obviously both the intelligence and the protection aspect, because I was also a trained special branch protection officer. Now, one evening during the visit was about 5 days, I believe, the Governor-General said she wished to go and see the theatre, and she wanted to see Phantom of the Opera. So that was a very popular thing. I just deconflicted to make sure that no other units would be going either in Special Branch or in Royalty, because of course the British police are generally not armed at all, and we, both in Special Branch and in Royalty Protection, are both armed and obviously in plain clothes, and therefore what I didn't want was a situation whereby somebody somehow saw a weapon and it set massive alarm bells ringing, because in Britain very few people have access to firearms, and particularly not sidearms. So therefore I deconflicted with Royalty and found out that on the day the Queen Mother and Princess Diana would actually be also at the theatre. So the Governor-General and I took our seats in the circle, a private room, and she asked me if it would be at all possible, because she knew that the Queen Mother would be there, to see the Queen Mother. She was a great fan and wished to see her. And I said I'd make a call and see if we could speak to Royalty and whether they could arrange it. So Royalty Protection did in due course, and in the first break, I and the Governor-General of Canada went along to see the Queen Mother. Now, sitting with the Queen Mother was, of course, Princess Diana, and as we came in, I explained to our wall the Queen Mother had stood up to turn to look, as had Princess Diana, and the Governor-General curtsied. The Queen Mother laid out a slight hand to her, and she took the hand slightly, and Princess Diana put her hand out, shook the hands of it. Now, of course, the Queen Mother didn't even acknowledge my presence. But Princess Diana did. She looked at me and nodded. I nodded. She put her hand out. I put my hand out and I shook her hand. And it would appear that the royals there were perturbed, particularly Royalty Protection, but the people that come with them saw the Queen Mother's maid of honour, etc. And Lady Diana's birth looked as though I had broken some protocol. I was never a great one for protocol, and that's why I would never have joined Royalty Protection. So that was that. We left. I said a few words to Diana. She said a few words to me. We left. And the Governor-General was very happy, having seen the Queen Mother. About 2 or so weeks later, because I was not only the desk officer for North America, but I was also the desk officer for Sub-Saharan Africa. And so I was engaged again on a protection operation, this time to protect the Foreign Secretary, Pick Botha, of the Republic of South Africa's apartheid regime. So I'd basically dropped Botha off again. I was in the role because I knew South Africa, knew the politics of it, and knew the situation as it pertained to the United Kingdom and what demonstrators there might be there or other actions that might have been taken by, say, Nkondo Sizwe which is the burning spear of the ANC, who might potentially have attempted to carry out an assassination attempt on him. So that was my role there. So we dropped off at the airport and he'd flown out of Heathrow. So we were driving back and I was back of the vehicle, a Jaguar limousine. And as we came down onto Park Lane, as always, just by the Dorchester, the traffic is in a massive standstill during the middle of the day. And there's loads of traffic there, as it used to be in those days. And I heard a horn beeping, and the driver of my vehicle and one of the guys said, "Somebody's trying to get your attention." And this horn kept being beeped. And then I said, "Who's that?" And the beeping kept going on. And then said, "No, look over there." And I looked over in the next lane towards me, and there was a blonde woman pointing over to me. So I looked, and I then realised it was Princess Diana. The protection officer from Royalty Protection who was driving her seemed embarrassed because she was leaning over, pressing the horn of the vehicle to try and grab my attention. So I was wondering, what do I do? Luckily, as life has it, the traffic began to move and the Royalty Protection Officer saw his chance and sped off into the daylight with Princess Diana. After that, our paths never crossed again. A decade and a half later, I was in Colombia with Kim Howells, a Foreign Office Minister, leading my high-threat, low-infrastructure team. Colombia's a dangerous place. And in the evening, Kim and I, who is a great politician, one of those few conviction politicians that you get, Kim and I were sat with the British ambassador to Colombia at the time. We were discussing a paper that I'd written when I was head of the Strategic Analysis Unit in the NPOI, National Public Intelligence Unit. In the paper, I'd explained that Britain, because it didn't explain its history and didn't explain the presence of black people and people of colour in the United Kingdom from at least 210 AD, when Emperor Septimus Severus, a black emperor of Rome, led his Legianus Africanus, his African legions, into Britain to protect Hadrian's Wall and prevent the Picts, the Scots, that is, from coming south over that wall. The African legions stayed for many a year, married women or just children with local women, and that was in Britain ever since that time. It's worth noting that obviously that's before the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain. So I was discussing this with Kim Howells and the then British ambassador to Colombia, Hayden Warren Gash, and explaining that because of this lack of knowledge regarding black presence, so the fact that in 1601, for example, Queen Elizabeth I sent out a proclamation saying that there are too many blackamoors, too many blacks, Moors meaning they were probably Islamic, too many blacks in Britain and they should be thrown out. 1780s, the parliamentarian stood up and said there's too many blacks in every village, town and hamlet in Britain. And so again, we need to look to these people, which is the reason why Sierra Leone was bought, to try and get rid of some of these black people who had come to Britain after the American War. We were discussing this matter, that, the black presence didn't just happen after 1948. I said this lends itself then for jihadi to recruit in Britain, because they simply say, you don't belong here, you've never been here, you don't belong here, and you're never respected here. And so we discussed this matter. Now Kim thought, yeah, that's great, as did Hayden, and they both said, you need to speak to Prince Charles and explain to him how, as a future king, how it will make a difference for all Britons to know the history of all of us, regardless of colour. So that was agreed. And we came back from Colombia, Kim and I, and he contacted me later at Scotland Yard. And he said, listen, I've got you an appointment with Sir Tom Shabir. And Sir Tom is the head of all of Prince Charles's charities, not just the Prince's Trust, but all of them. So I duly went to Clarence House and spoke to Tom and explained the circumstance of what I was trying to do. I was trying to prevent what I believed would soon be terrorism on Britain's own soil from jihadis, because we had not dealt with this issue of Britain's intermingled racial past, and that frankly, Britons have never been just white. And if we can get this message over, we can then give people a sense of belonging. So Tom listened, as patricians do, and he then said, okay, there is a function happening very shortly. Dust off your best suit, evening wear, and can be introduced to Prince Charles at this function. It's, I believe he said, 3 days' time. I explained to him that unfortunately I couldn't do that because I was leaving to go to Afghanistan the following day and that I wouldn't be back for about 2.5 to 3 weeks. So could we make this appointment sometime later? It never materialised. So that was my first opportunity to meet Prince Charles, which never happened. Now, if you move forward a couple of years, I was in my office in the Yard and I got a call from the Secretary of the Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, Sir David Vaness, and AXO, that's Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, wanted me to see him. Now, I knew David Vaness quite well because of several reasons. One, I knew him obviously when I was a case officer for MI6 because he had to authorise that. I knew him from various actions that had taken place. I knew him when I'd created a new organisation. It was a counter-reconnaissance team and protection, and he was a great fan of that, and I'd spoken to the Americans about it. He'd also recommended that I become the head of the Iraqi Special Branch, that's the Iraqi Secret Police, once we had, the Americans and ourselves, the coalition, had invaded Iraq and taken over after the Iraq. So I knew David Vaness very well. So I went into the office, which was always full of loads of files. A very important guy who was fully on top of his game. And you cannot always say that about senior people in any role, not only within the Metropolitan Police. David Vaness was also head of Scotland Yard's Special Branch. So my boss. So I went into the office and he explained that Prince Charles had been invited by a senior Saudi royal prince to spend time in the desert, get to one with the desert and also paint and do various other things. He knew this was potentially dangerous because it had been advertised, and he therefore wished that I would go to Saudi Arabia as the intelligence officer, because as I explained before, royalty protection protect the royals, but they're not intelligence officers and have no intelligence aspect. So he knew that I could hook up with all the necessary people. That would be our agency in Saudi Arabia, so that in Saudi, and obviously the Saudi intelligence and security authorities, and hook with them and connect with UK military if we were going to provide any military assistance to the royalty protection presence there, and put together an intelligence package for the process. I asked when he wanted me to leave, and he said, "Can you leave today?" I did. I went to Saudi Arabia, put together the intelligence package, worked it through, and that's where I met the Royal Prince, and he said, "You can stay here." Now, when he said here, what he meant is he had his own hotel. And the hotel was as lavish as you can imagine. And that must have been, I'm guessing, 300 rooms. But in this hotel, I appeared to be the only guest. And when you went downstairs to dinner from what was a suite, which you had as your room, a chandelier, which he had, by the way, must have covered at least, I would say, 6 floors of this hotel. A massive chandelier which came down. This was absolutely impressive. You went into the restaurant, and the restaurant was filled with food, any sorts that you could imagine. And I saw nobody else there but for me. Anyway, that's by the by. I did what I needed to do. The Prince spent time, actually a curtailed time, because what happened is prior to Prince Charles getting there, there was a massive earthquake in Iran. So Prince Charles carried out his royal duties there in terms of that earthquake and had to shorten his visit prior to turning up in Saudi Arabia. When he turned up, I quickly introduced myself, but of course he was being dealt with by royalty protection. So on the way back from Saudi after the visit, he was offered a ride on the Saudi Prince's Royal Flight, which was a 747, which was converted to a superb standard. Fantastic. Somebody's living room and bedroom, like somebody's apartment, really. But when I checked, I realised that this aircraft didn't have defensive aids. In other words, if a missile was fired at it, it didn't have any of the aids that aircraft have to prevent those missiles from locking onto their targets. So I explained this to the royalty protection officer heading up the operation and said, "I'll explain to Prince Charles, and my recommendation is that he does not fly back on this plane, albeit that he's been offered it by the Saudi prince." The royalty officer, more senior officer than I, said, "But I'll explain it to the prince that this is your recommendation." So the visit ended. We were going to go back in what's known as a royal flight, and the aircraft we were using was quite a small aircraft of the Queen's flight. It is a RAF aircraft, so it does have the defensive aids, but only holds about 15 people. So I asked if I could catch a lift on this aircraft back to the United Kingdom. Otherwise, I'd business class it back to Britain on a scheduled aircraft. So He said, yeah, there's a place for you if you want it. So I went to the back part of the aircraft. Part of that aircraft was with Prince Charles and his equerry. And then behind that were other people, including the protection guys. So I was in that back seat. And it's comfortable and the RAF treats you well and you get good food. But it can't make the run in one. So we landed down in Cyprus on the British sovereign base in Cyprus. And just as we were landing, the Prince's equerry, and that's the military officer who looks after the Prince, came back to me and said, His Royal Highness would like to speak to you when we land in Cyprus. I said, okay, fair enough. He said, well, I'll get you when we land. And he was excited. We land in Cyprus and Prince Charles is on the tarmac and the equerry's jivvying me on. Quick. His Royal Highness is there. I said, yes, I know. So I walk over to Prince Charles, put my hand out to shake his hand. He has his, as one sees, I don't know Prince Charles, as I said to you before, as one sees on television, had his hands in his pockets. I instinctively put my hand out to shake hands. And I guess that wasn't the royal thing to do. Matters not. He shook hands, we shook hands. And he said, are you the intelligence man who forbade me from travelling the Prince's flight? I said, yes, I am. Who are you? So I explained who I am, the organisation I'm from, my background. So why have you forbade me? And I explained that I've got intelligence, that I know what the capabilities are of some of the terrorist groups in Saudi. I told him that intelligence appeared to suggest that the terrorists had access to capabilities that would allow them to down that flight and that we wouldn't want that to happen after a successful operation. So therefore, I had forbidden him to fly back on it. He asked the obvious question and said, why is my aircraft safe then? And I said, because it has defensive aids. And those defensive aids would protect against much or many of the weaponry that was available. He wondered, I guess, why the Prince didn't have such aids. And laughingly, I said, I would suggest that in the very near future, that aircraft would also be fitted with the aids that our RAF aircraft already possesses. He agreed. And so we then spent time talking. And all the time whilst I was talking to Prince, I guess for about 10 minutes, I could see the equerry trying to jivvy me away. He was like he was on hot coals. He was stepping from one foot to the other. He was making sort of coughing noises as though, that's your time, my friend. The Prince wanted to speak. So we were speaking about intelligence matters. We spoke about artistic matters and various other things. So I found him to be a very interesting individual. But unfortunately, the people around him wanted to shield him from a person like me. Quite interesting. The truth of the matter is that in my 30 years of being involved in secret intelligence, national security and governmental personal protection, and in that realm of knowledge, it generally isn't the powerful individuals, the presidents, the prime ministers, the royals, actually don't have an affinity to the people necessarily. They can't understand the people, obviously, particularly if you're royals. You can't, because you've never lived the life of the normal person. But there is an intuitive interest generally in these people. The problem is, it's the gatekeepers, like the equerry, who seem to not want to let these powerful people know what is actually going on, or let them have contact with people who can provide that information in some way, shape or means. The gatekeepers basically live off the power of the individual, and they're the ones who tend to orchestrate how much, how far, how little the powerful person understands and gets to see. And that example is one right there, where the equerry was the one who could not wait to get me away from a man who had an absolute interest in my sphere of influence and knowledge. He just couldn't wait for my conversation to end. And that leads me superbly into another story of a royal, which in the end turned out to be, I would say, a sad story, not from my perspective, because I didn't know at that time, but for the individual. This was many years before. At the time I was DC. When I was dealing with Prince Charles, I was a detective inspector, a relatively senior individual. But this time I was a DC in special branch. And what had happened is that the Queen of Nepal had stated that she wanted to come to the United Kingdom. Well, Nepal has very close connections with the UK. We have the Gurkhas, who are part of the British military, and so one needs to look after the Nepalese. So I was tasked with the job of performing the protection. It's a simple job. One man, one driver, me in charge of the operation. And then, of course, I could then decide what I needed in order to make the protection safe. She was bringing her own protection officers, obviously all individuals do, as I would travel globally with my Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, whomever, and the royals would travel with the royals. It is exactly the same for other countries. They travel with them. So she brought her own protection officers. basically, I waited at the airport for her arrival on a police flight. She came down, as I always do, and one always does in protection, or should do, particularly in the old British special branch style. And it's a style that I tried to bring about into SO1 Specialist Protection once special branch was disbanded. And I was one of the creators of the new unit which carried out protection then. And by the way, I want you to understand that Scotland Yard Special Branch carried out protection throughout the United Kingdom and throughout the globe for British individuals. She came in, went through the things that one needs to do as a country in terms of immigration and so on and so forth. You don't do that standing in line, you do that in a special suite, which is set aside. It's all very nice, and one gets food, whatever one needs. And the immigration officers come to them, and that's how it all works there. Totally beautiful VIP system they've got set up. And then with our vehicles, we drove off. Vehicle convoy, 2 Nepalese on the back with their embassy, me in the vehicle with the princess. And I think she landed about 6 or something by the time we got back into central London. I think at the time I'd organised that we get some motorcycle riders, because it was something that the Queen on that particular route through London to get us through to her offices where she was staying. I think she was staying in the Ritz at the time, so I'd be staying in the room next to her. And so it was all set. She came in, and then she came in the room, presidential suite in the Ritz. Great, fantastic. I'm in the room next door, protection team. They sat outside the room. And then a knock came on the door, and the princess came into my room with one of the guys. And she said, I love Hanleys because I wanted to get something for the children. She had several children. Would it be possible to do that? And I looked at Hanley's Times. I said, I think Hanley's is closed now. This is the time before mobile phones and all the rest of it. But I contacted the yard and said, do we have a contact for Hanley's? Yes, we do. Great. So we got onto the telephone, managed to get the manager of Hanley's and said, listen, Royal Queen of Nepal here. She would like to come into your store. I know you're closed. Could you make an exception? Could she come in? She wants to purchase things. Yes. Great. So we go into Hanley's, travel down there. We collect what she needs for her children, various toys, and we then make our way back. She says, tomorrow I'd like to visit my son, who is staying at the house of a lord. He's at Eton. I knew all this, obviously, because I'd done the background, and I knew my son was at Eton, and I knew that where he was staying. So we were going to drive down and see this individual. So I said to her, we'd need to leave at such and such a time to get there, for the time you wish to get there. And we can do that, no problem. But obviously we won't have motorbikes or anything like that as outriders. Vehicle convoy, and we'll get there, and I'll look after you from there. So she said, okay, great. As I said, I've introduced myself, and you must understand, when you meet any person whom you're protecting under our system, our way of doing it in the UK, you introduce yourself, be that the President of the United States of Russia or whomever. You introduce yourself and say who you are, and that I'll be the person who's be in charge of making the protection for you. That's how it works. That's how you get an understanding with individuals, and that's how, hopefully, if something starts to go wrong, they will listen to your commands and do exactly what you tell them to do in the circumstance of a problem. So what we did then is, in the morning, had breakfast, room service, got into the vehicles, went down. So as we drive down, and we come into this splendid stately home where young Prince will be staying with his friend from Eton, who's an Englishman, aristocratic line, and they're not there. Apparently they're out on the estate, and this is a massive estate. So I said to the estate owner, I spoke to obviously the owner of the stately home. He put me in touch with his estate manager, and I said, listen, Queen very much wants to see her son immediately. She's very excited to see him. She hasn't seen him for some time. Can we go out and find him if you know whereabouts he is? And it said, yes, you can use this vehicle to do so. So I'm driving the Queen. I left my drive with our vehicles, and one of the senior protection officers from the police get on board. It's only a 2-seater really, but he sits on the back of the 2-seater. So I said to the Queen, I said, are you okay with what we're doing? She said, oh, fantastic. This is great. So we start driving around. I said, oh, I've never been anywhere like this, over humps and stuff, I said, do you like to drive? And she said, yes, but I don't drive. I can't really drive. I can drive, but I don't drive. I get driven, and this is off-road. I said, do you fancy driving this? She said, I'd love to. Behind me to her protection guy, and I said, the Queen would like to drive. Is that okay with you? Because I don't want to take his position away. He isn't particularly happy, but clearly he knows the Queen wants to. He's a perfect English speaker. He understands English perfect. So the Queen gets in the seat and we drive off, and she's loving it, and we're talking and she's happy, and it's fun. I could see she felt like she was 18 again. She's driving, fantastic, brilliant. And we look around and we can't see the Prince. He's not there. So we drive back to the stately home. And as we're driving along to the stately home, she's in the driving seat. I'm in the seat next to her, and her protection officer's on the back behind, holding for for dear life. I can see the scene there. It's a fantastic scene. And we're driving and we see this massive stately hall in front of us. And then as we drive along and we're coming to the end, standing there is the royal prince outside, and the owner of the property is there as well. So we drive through, Queen pulls up, and I could see immediately that the royal prince was not happy, that his mother was acting in a manner which I imagine he thought was not royal. And she became rigid, and her demeanour changed, and her freedom was lost. I tell you this story because sometimes, for some, protection, indeed the role that you have, can be like a golden cage. It can hold you in and suck out of you the pleasure of life. For a fleeting 15, 20 minutes, the Queen had all the freedom in the world. She was alive. She loved it. And I was able to bring that little bit of happiness to her. Some several years later, that same prince took a machine gun, went to the royal palace in Kathmandu and killed all his family. You can be at the crossroads of history in the game I was in. You can see people for what they are, and you can understand that life isn't always what some people might think it is. So I guess what I'm saying in this episode, Royalty and Me, is that, and I've met many royals from many different places, but the connection in what I've just spoken to you about of the last 30 minutes or so is that all of them, from Princess Diana to the Queen of Nepal, both of whom are dead, to Prince Charles, the future king, who still is not king as yet, to the Saudi prince whom I met, all of them actually had something which was taken from them, or which was not given to them, or which is not within them to be free. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that one should feel sorry for these people, because in my travels, and I've been to probably 3/4 countries of the world, I've seen devilish poverty. I've seen people dying because they've broken their arm and can't get to a hospital. I've seen living children with their stomachs extended. I've seen people of 8, 9, 10 whom, when organising an operation, I have to speak to because they are the lieutenant, captain, or whatever of a ragtag army, say in Goma, in the Congo, and have been killing people since they were 7 because some lunatic is a general at 35 and somebody else is ripping all of the assets out of the country, and they're paying this guy to get the assets cheaply. So I'm not saying that there are not sufferings. And if you've been to Rwanda and you see how many people died, 1 million people died dastardly within 100 days. Frankly, the people I've just spoken to you about have a pretty good life. But that said, a part of them is often given away in order to maintain the status they have. See you next week.
Carlton King is a real-life working-class spy, bringing you the details, the stories, and secrets from his life spent spying. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple iTunes, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of the excitement. This is for your ears only.
My name's Carlton King, and I'm an ex-spy.
This podcast was produced by a podcast company. If you need help with your podcast, simply visit apodcastcompany.com or email Jason at apodcastcompany.com.